Tonight, I'm a decent man. The ousted Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro, has his day in court in New York, pleading not guilty to charges of drug trafficking after his capture by US Special Forces. China and Russia launch a twin attack in the United States against Donald Trump's action. Tonight, we'll look at how events in New York today could lead to a new world order of power politics. Meanwhile, here, as the Parliament meets to discuss the crisis, the Prime Minister refused to say whether he believes America broke international law over its attack on Venezuela, as the government ducks direct criticism of the US presidents. Meanwhile, there is anger outside Downing Street as MPs join protesters to condemn what they believe to be an illegal operation. I'll be speaking to the former Labour Party leader, Jeremy Corbyn. Who's next as Donald Trump turns his sights to Greenland? What would the implications be of an attack on a fellow NATO country? I'll be speaking to the former Defence Secretary, Sir Ben Wallace. All that and more with our panel this evening: Jeremy Brown, Sir Mark Lyle-Grant and Jasmine El Gamal, who'll be with us for the next hour. It is Monday. I'm Darren McCaffrey, live from Westminster. This is the Politics Hub. A very good evening and welcome to the programme. There is only one story in town tonight. That is that the ousted Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro, has appeared in a New York courtroom on narco-terrorism and weapons charges, pleading not guilty and declaring himself a prisoner of war. It comes after his dramatic capture in Caracas by US forces, in the wake of which Donald Trump has hinted at further military action on the South American continent. Maduro and his wife, who've been transferred to court, happened in the full glare of cameras in New York today. The couple were taken from the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn to the court building in Manhattan, travelling together by road and helicopter. As you can see here, the ousted Venezuelan leader was handcuffed as he was transferred from a heavily armoured vehicle to another car. Quite extraordinary scenes. He was then brought to a helicopter to be flown into Manhattan. And after a short flight, the deposed president and his wife remain handcuffed as they were helped out of the helicopter by DEA agents, another step towards their appearance in court. Now heavily flanked by guards, the pair were then transferred into an armoured car for the final part of the journey to the courthouse. Well, after an appearance in court that lasted around 50 minutes, Mr. Maduro was then made to do the reverse journey, with his next court date set for the 17th of March this year. Well, let's get more of what happened inside that court. Bring in our US correspondent, James Matthews, who's with us tonight live from New York. Quite extraordinary, James, when you step back and look at those images that we've seen play on our TV screens today. Just talk us through what happened in court itself.
Yeah, hi, Darren. Extraordinary would be the word for a man who, not 72 hours ago, remember, was the president of Venezuela, was receiving Chinese visitors in the luxury, the opulence of his presidential palace. Just hours later, he was snatched, captured by US Special Forces, and in the course of a weekend, he is prisoner, Nicolas Maduro, and we saw him treated and transported as such today from the MDC, the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, helicoptered over the East River within sight of the Statue of Liberty, ironically. He was landed, then put into the Bearcat and then transported with his wife in the back into the basement of the building behind me, the federal courthouse, where he was kept in a holding cell for several hours until that midday appearance before the judge, 92-year-old Bill Clinton-appointed Alvin Hellerstein. It lasted around about a quarter of an hour longer, as you said, Darren. He walked into court. He was in prison garb, a black and an orange shirt. He wore orange shoes. And in the course of this hearing, he made it clear that he felt himself not guilty. He also asserted very defiantly that he remained the president of Venezuela. Let me read you what exactly he said. He was asked by the judge, are you Nicolas Maduro? His answer was this, in Spanish: I am Nicolas Maduro, the constitutional president of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. Taken against my will, he used the word sequestrado, in a military operation by the government of the United States. I am a prisoner of war, he said, and I avail myself of the rights under the Geneva Convention. He was appearing, of course, alongside his wife, Celia Flores. She too pleaded not guilty to the charges against her. They both face a number of charges. She's involved in the drug running charges, which are at the heart of the indictment. Barry Pollock, he was the man appointed as the attorney for Maduro, at least for today. Famous, high profile as a lawyer in this country. He's the man who represented and engineered the release of Julian Assange, founder of WikiLeaks. He was sitting by Nicolas Maduro. He was asked on his exit from court that whether or not he thought whether or not he had any comment on Maduro's claims that he was kidnapped. I think what President Maduro said in court speaks for itself, he said. So there we are. That's how it went down in court, both pleading not guilty. Nicolas Maduro asserting defiance and asserting his status as he sees it, that he remains the president of Venezuela. Both need medical attention. We heard that from their lawyers. And Nicolas Maduro, he wants access to consular representation. He wants to speak to the Venezuelans who represent his country in the United States. Clearly, there is much about the politics of this as there is about criminal prosecution. But in terms of prosecution, the next court hearing date, Darren, is going to be 17th of March, 11 a.m.
OK, James, live for us there in New York. Thank you very much indeed. We'll just take you now to Caracas. These are pictures inside the National Assembly there, where a new president has been sworn in, Delcy Rodriguez. Of course, she was the vice president up until a couple of days ago. Well, she is now Venezuela's new leader. It must be said with somewhat of the tacit consent of the United States. We heard Donald Trump talk about Rodriguez over the weekend, that effectively kind of accepting that she would become the transitional leader, if you like, from at least the United States point of view. We've also heard kind of different statements, if you like, from Delcy Rodriguez in recent days. Some of them attacking the United States action, wanting to see Nicolas Maduro return back to Caracas. A little bit of a change of tone, though, in the last 12 to 24 hours or so. Seemingly more of a willingness to work with the United States. But those are the latest pictures now, where Delcy Rodriguez has been sworn in now as Venezuela's new leader in front of members of that National Assembly and clearly members of the military too. Well, the US action has sparked reaction, of course, across the globe. And back here, the Prime Minister's refused to say whether America's attack on Venezuela broke international law. He was speaking a little earlier to our political editor, Beth Rigby.
Prime Minister, has US action in Venezuela violated international law?
Well, the most important thing in Venezuela is a transition to democracy, a peaceful transition. Now, that was our position before the weekend. It remains our position. And in relation to the illegitimate president of Venezuela, there aren't going to be many tears shed.
No, but
I do think the framework, the anchor has to be international law,
right.
as you'd expect me to say. The situation is complicated. It's even complicated today. And obviously the US will want to justify its
But has
actions.
it violated international law?
Well, the framework
That's my
has to
question.
be international law. It's a complicated situation. The most important thing at the moment is that peaceful transition to democracy.
PM, France, Spain, Canada, Germany, as well as the UN Secretary-General, have all said that the US has violated international law. Has the US violated international law?
Well, international law is really important. It's the framework, and it's for the US to set out its justifications for the actions that it's taken. But it is a complicated situation. It remains a complicated situation.
So you're not going to say whether you think
the
they
most
have or
important
haven't?
thing, the most important thing is stability and that peaceful transition to democracy. That's what matters to Venezuela above all else, and that was the position we took before the weekend. It's still our position
So
now.
you're not going to say whether you think they have or haven't, just to be clear?
I'm going to be clear that I believe in international law. I've long been an advocate for international law. I'm absolutely clear that is the framework that applies.
Okay.
Obviously, it'll be for the US to set out their justification in relation to the action that they have taken.
You don't want to call it out?
Well, that was Beth speaking to the Prime Minister a little earlier, trying to get an answer from him. Well, this is the scene live now outside Downing Street, where, as you can see, there is a demonstration taking place against the US's action in Venezuela. A number of MPs are there in support of those protesters. Let's bring in Amanda Acas, who is at the demonstration. And Amanda, clearly people there wanting Parliament and indeed the government to go further in the condemnation of what they claim is an illegal act.
Well, yes, absolutely. It's absolutely freezing here, and we think some 800 or so have actually come out to this protest outside the gates of Downing Street to make their feelings known. You can see them sort of lined up along Whitehall here, flying their flags and listening to the speakers on the stage. Quite a few flags from Venezuela, also a lot of Cuban flags. Clearly, we've spoken to quite a few people from other Latin American countries who say they're concerned that what happened in Venezuela could end up happening there. The chants, you can probably hear some of them, but the main one has been Free Maduro, calling for Keir Starmer to grow a spine and to condemn the actions of Donald Trump. No blood for oil is another one that we've heard repeatedly. In terms of the protesters themselves, the majority say they wanted to come out to show their solidarity with the Venezuelans. Many trade unions here as well saying they're in solidarity with the workers of Venezuela. People say they're concerned about the violation of a nation's sovereignty. They're disturbed about the collapse of the global rules-based order. They're concerned about the future world for their grandchildren, and they're concerned about what might happen to other countries, like, for example, Cuba. However, I did speak to one Venezuelan who claimed here. Now, he claimed he was the only Venezuelan here. I've been trying to find others, and he was the only one I managed to find, but there may well indeed be others with different views. But certainly he said he wants here because he wanted to make the point that not everyone agrees, and he wanted to celebrate the fall of Maduro. He didn't like what had happened, the way it was done, but said that this is something that Venezuelans want to celebrate, and he doesn't know what's going to happen now, but he's angry with the rest of the international community for not having done more to deal with what he described as a dictator and a fraudulent election. So clearly there isn't one agreed position here, but for Keir Starmer, he's under a lot of pressure, particularly from left-wing MPs, some of whom have been addressing this rally, Jeremy Corbyn, but also from his own party, Kim Johnson as one of them, who've described his response to this so far and refusing to condemn what's happened, or to describe it as a breach of international law, as shameless, shameful and reckless. And clearly he and his ministers are coming under real pressure to give a more detailed response from the UK.
OK, Amanda, live for us there outside Downing Street. Thank you very much indeed. Well, a little earlier, I spoke to the co-founder of your party and the independent MP for Islington North, Jeremy Corbyn, of course, who is going to that demonstration. And I spoke before he decided to travel off there. Jeremy, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Obviously talking about Nicolas Maduro, who has been in court in New York today. He has described himself as a decent man. Do you think he's a decent man?
He's the president of Venezuela, and the issue is the illegality of what the United States have done. It isn't whether he's a nice man or a bad man or a good man or whatever. The question is, international law does not allow one country, even the USA, to go in and kidnap the president of another country. If they do that, how are they going to complain if anybody else does the same anywhere else?
Let me take on both of those things if I can. It does matter, surely, if he's a decent... I mean, is he a friend of yours? Would you describe him as a friend?
I've met him. I was interviewed by him on a television programme many years ago while I was at the UN Human Rights Council, and he was deputy to Chavez, as you know, and the country has obviously had enormous problems, not least because of the huge level of sanctions by the USA on it, and that has created a lot of problems. Now,
would you describe him as a friend, though, or an ally?
I don't know him well enough to be able to say that.
OK. The reason I say this, you say it doesn't matter whether he's a decent guy or not. I mean, this is from Amnesty International. You're an internationalist. Amnesty is an important organisation, saying that last year after the presidential election, 24 people died as a result of the government's repression. 2 of the victims were children, and 1 was a police officer. There's been arbitrary detentions and unfair trials. Now, let's park aside what the United States done for a second. Surely it's a good thing that he's not president of Venezuela anymore, given he is not a nice guy.
But that should be a decision for the people of Venezuela, not a decision for the US president, who is not interested in human rights. He's interested in oil.
Can you bring yourself to say that he's not a nice guy, that his regime has killed people?
I read the Amnesty report, and obviously I was very disturbed by what was in it. And I've also read a great deal and met a lot of people who've described the terrible economic situation that Venezuela faces. And so there's a twin set of problems there that have to be addressed. Now, if the US was serious about dealing with human rights abuses, which they are not. They're not anywhere in the world.
Yeah, but are you? That's my point.
Of course I am.
Well, you have to. Well, why don't you say categorically he was a pretty evil dictator?
You seem to be trying to move this whole conversation away from the reality of what Trump has done. Invaded another country.
But if you answer the question, if you condemn him, I'll move on.
Look, of course the human rights abuses are wrong. Of course they are. Okay. I've always said that. I've never supported human rights abuses anywhere, for that matter.
OK. So let's take on your second point then, which is this is from the Human Rights Foundation, again, another widely recognised international organisation. It says that last year's election was patently fraudulent. And that is the agreement of lots and lots of organisations and countries. Nicolas Maduro is not the legitimate president of Venezuela. He stole that election last year, didn't he?
That is the assessment made by quite a lot of organisations. It's not the assessment made by everybody in Venezuela. There are people who clearly do support Maduro and still do support Maduro. That is obviously...
Do you think he's the legitimate president?
You seem to be trying to move the whole conversation onto protecting Donald Trump.
Well, because you're saying that
you're protecting Donald Trump. You're protecting Trump.
Well, your party is claiming that he needs to be returned back to Venezuela, that he is the legitimate head of government, that he is the president.
Constitutionally, he is the head of government.
Well, I'm saying to you that in 2019 and 2024...
Who are we to decide?
It's not we. It's lots of international organisations who follow these elections, lots of democratic countries around the world say that President Maduro stole that election.
And lots of countries around the world are now, today, saying that what the US has done is illegal, is wrong, and is a violation of all aspects of international law. Why don't you concentrate on that as well?
Well, we can do. Some of those countries, by the way.
That.
Well, we are. I mean, you clearly don't think the US's action was justified.
Of course not.
Of course, and you've made that point, and that is an argument that many people will agree with.
It's a clear point, a violation of every aspect of international law, and even governments that were not terribly supportive of Maduro, Latin American governments, Chile, for example, which was actually quite critical of Maduro, they have joined with other Latin American heads of state in saying this is absolutely wrong. Look at the statement made this morning by Claudia Sheinbaum, President of Mexico. Again, they weren't without criticism of Maduro, but they've said quite clearly this is an attack on all of Latin America that's gone on. And this is a very, very serious day in international affairs when the biggest armed country in the world, the USA, decides international law doesn't matter.
OK, and I've let you make that point, and it's a very important one, and there are many people at home and many people in Westminster who will agree with that. All I'm asking you is, do you think he's a thug? I think you're kind of suggesting he probably was a bit of a thug. My main question, though, is whether he was and should be recognised as the president of Venezuela, given the fact that many people, many well-recognised international organisations and countries say he has stolen not just one, but 2 elections.
He is recognised the president of Venezuela.
He's not by this
can I
country,
finish? By a vast number of countries around the world, including
Iran,
this country,
Russia.
including this country, which maintains diplomatic relations with Venezuela at this very moment.
There you go. That was Jeremy Corbyn's take on all of this. Let's bring in our panel tonight. Delighted to say we have got Jeremy Brown, the Chief Executive of Canning House and former Foreign Office Minister, former National Security Advisor and former Ambassador to the UN, Sir Mark Lyle Grant, and Foreign Policy Analyst and former Pentagon Advisor Jasmine El Gamal. A very good evening to you all. What a panel on what is a very significant day, and my word, what a weekend. And Jasmine, what a weekend. What's your assessment of the last 48, 72 hours?
I mean, I think everyone's still wrapping their head around exactly what's happened in the last 48 hours. But I think one thing that has become entirely clear is that this is Donald Trump's world and we're just living in it. He has proven that international law doesn't mean anything. The word and the respect of allies doesn't mean anything. The US Congress doesn't mean anything. What matters is what Donald Trump decides to do. And he has been enabled in so many ways. And we can go into this later, but if you look at the reaction of European leaders, UK leaders, and Prime Minister Keir Starmer can't even say whether or not this was an illegal act and whether he condemns it. So this is the reality of the situation now. Donald Trump is in charge. It's the way he wants it to be. And the question is, what does that mean for the rest of the world moving forward?
Mark?
Well, I agree absolutely with what Jasmine says. What we're dealing with now is what was called in the US national security strategy a month ago as the Monroe Doctrine with a Trump corollary. Donald Trump himself now calls that the Donroe Doctrine. Now, if we thought that was a sort of isolationist United States, I think we were quite wrong. It's saying we will assert our power directly in the Western Hemisphere, i.e. all of the Americas, but also we will have a say on everything else that happens in the world. And although we're focusing quite rightly on the dramatic events of the last 48 hours in Venezuela, if you think what President Trump has done, bombing Iranian nuclear facilities, bombing northern Nigeria in defense of Christians, this is not an isolationist president. This is a president determined to sort of bend the world to his will. And I think that's what we've seen over the last weekend.
On this subject of kind of America's backyards, I mean, there is an argument to make. I mean, we shouldn't be surprised, maybe some might say, about what's happened over the weekend. I mean, the Ronald Reagan aircraft carrier has been there since October. I mean, something was inevitably going to happen, wasn't it?
But it's a big change because for the last 20 years or so, the US has slowly retreated in terms of its wider influence in Latin America, and China has filled that gap. China is the biggest trading partner of South America now, not the US. And now Donald Trump has completely, not for the first time, I mean, it's a stunning intervention. And the implications they're obviously huge for Venezuela, but he is taking a close interest in Argentinian politics, the recent Chilean presidential election, very much the Honduras election. He's close to the El Salvador president. He's having rows the whole time with the president of Colombia. He's interested in the Panama Canal. So suddenly the US, from being, several steps removed from Latin America and disinterested in a lot of their own hemisphere, is across it in a big way, as well as the wider implications for the rest of the world.
We're going to go on the wider implications in a little bit, and I want to talk about the UK politics in a bit. Jasmine, can I just take on this idea that this is kind of a pivotal moment in the sense of, the United States, you look at Grenada, you look at what happened in Nicaragua. I mean, the United States has definitely always thought of, Latin America as its backyard. You look at what happened in Iraq, you look at the airstrikes that we saw in Syria, Libya. You could argue this is actually just pretty consistent US policy, that actually things haven't changed that dramatically. The United States has taken military action when it wants, whenever it wants, for little regard for international law for quite a long period of time.
Yes and no. I mean, there are different degrees to that. I mean, I would say under Democratic presidents, there was much more respect for international law, relatively speaking. Again, it's a low bar. But there was a respect for the transatlantic alliance. There was a respect for, somewhat, with some exceptions, the rule-based international order. But you're right in the sense that when U.S. presidents have taken actions that were in violation of international law or were strictly in favor of U.S. national interests, they were never really held accountable, whether domestically or internationally. I wrote something recently just about since 9/11 and all of the different policy decisions that U.S. presidents have taken, everything from Guantanamo to extraordinary renditions to ICE kidnappings. I mean, these are all things that drone strikes in Yemen that U.S. presidents have not been held accountable for. So why would Donald Trump think it would be any different from him? But I just want to make a quick point. I don't think you're right. The U.S. is not as isolationist under Trump as we thought it would be, or as even he said it would be. But it's also not very interested in, it's not interested in nation building. It's not interested in long, drawn-out involvement.
It's still acting essentially as America first in a different way.
It's go in, get what you want, and come back.
Mark, let's talk about the UK's response to all of this. I mean, I don't know if you saw kind of Beth's trying to get some type of answer out of Keir Starmer earlier on today. I mean, what's your sense? I mean, no one's going to say that sometimes these trying to get this diplomatically right can be challenging, but it seems kind of a little bit pathetic.
Well, look, it's very difficult. If I was still the National Security Advisor, I'd be advising the Prime Minister to be very careful to try and avoid saying this is illegal, even though it clearly is in violation of international law,
Why would you advise?
Well, because of the investment we have in the transatlantic relationship and the fact that Donald Trump takes things very personally. So I think Keir Starmer's done a very good job in building a relationship with Donald Trump, which wasn't obvious given that, you know, he's a former human rights lawyer from the sort of left of the party and Donald Trump is a property magnate, etc. But nonetheless, they have got on quite well, and that's been of benefit to the United Kingdom's national interests in terms of trade deals, etc. So he's not going to want to upset that by sort of unnecessarily, in his view, saying, we're going to condemn this, it's against international law. So he's trying to sort of manage that tightrope decision, and that makes it extremely difficult, particularly if he comes under pressure from his own party.
And Jeremy, but then the counter point, I suppose, that is, well, at the end of the day, when does the United Kingdom stand up? What does President Trump have to do? As in,
I agree with Mark. I think it is very difficult for Keir Starmer because the US is our most important single bilateral relationship, and alienating the president of that country is not something to be done lightly. But I wonder whether we're a bit dancing on the head of a pin, because we all know, and Keir Starmer knows as well, that it is a violation of international law. But in a way, what does that prove? I mean, it's a bit like shouting handball at the referee when you're watching a rugby match. I mean, the rules of the game are being changed in front of our eyes by Donald Trump. And we're still talking about the game as we knew it up until Trump. And I think we need to be wise to the game as it is now, which is not necessarily a good thing. Many people will think that's to be lamented, but I just think it's the reality. And I think Starmer is right to be very tough or strong on the European dimension. I think he has a bigger remit there. I think it is harder for him in Venezuela, and that mirrors the wider problems we have as a country.
There is a lot to get through for the moment. Thank you very much, all three of you. We're going to be talking about the wider implications a little later on in the programme. This story, of course, is going to feature in tonight's press preview, looking at tomorrow's newspapers and indeed tonight's news. Joining us will be Kevin Maguire from the Daily Mirror and the Daily Mail's Whitehall editor, Claire Elcott. That's from 10:30 tonight here on Sky News. OK, you're watching The Politics Hub. Up next, in the wake of that US military action in Venezuela, Donald Trump floats the idea of the US taking over Greenland. We'll be getting reaction to that from a panel and also from the former Defence Secretary, Sir Ben Wallace.
What's the best thing about being a Sky News journalist?
Who's funnier?
Being a Sky News journalist.
A special edition of The World with me, Yalda Hakim.
Pakistan has the right to respond.
You're like, what?
A historic day here today. Congratulations, this is a huge moment. But what happens now?
Welcome back to the Politics Hub. Let's get more, of course, now on the US military action in Venezuela, because in the wake of which Donald Trump has re-upped his threats to take over Greenland. And actually, in the last couple of minutes, we've heard from the Greenland Prime Minister, who is saying that it is unfair, this according to the Reuters news agency, to compare Greenland to Venezuela, that they are a democratic society, and that they are working on strengthening their dialogue with allied countries and with NATO, and that also they are trying to establish a direct line with Washington, given kind of effectively the threats, if you like, that we've heard from some in Washington over the last 24 hours or so. Let's bring in former Defence Secretary Sir Ben Wallace, who is with us in the studio. Ben, very good evening to you. I mean, you know, Venezuela is one thing. What's your take on... I mean, by the way, we've heard some of this before, but the statements from some connected with the Trump administration in regards to Greenland in the last 24 hours.
Well, I think the voices you hear from the administration are really confirming that Donald Trump is a president who believes in spheres of influence rather than the sort of rule of law. And that was pretty public in their national security strategy that recently was published. There was a large part of it, the first part of it was talking about the Western Hemisphere. And for your viewers, the definition of the Western Hemisphere is South America, Central America, the Caribbean, Greenland and Canada. It's not just where, you might think. And, that national security strategy is full of, really, this sense that we have spheres of influence. And you've now heard people called the sort of relaunch of the Monroe document, which was a 19th century doctrine of the United States that said to Europe at the time, you stay out of our backyard and we'll stay out of yours. And people are now nicknaming it the Don Roe doctrine. So I think that's what we have in this United States president, not a man who believes in the rules-based system, but a man who believes in spheres of influence where the mighty control that sphere. That's why he seems much more understanding of President Putin. Potentially, it's encouraging for President Xi. And that leaves us, Europe, United Kingdom, in the middle. And countries who have benefited from the rules-based system and probably scratching our heads at the moment what to do next.
And we'll come on to talk about Ukraine and the implications in a second. Just on Greenland itself, I don't want to game this out too much, but what do you think our response would be, should be, if he ever did something over Greenland, given the fact that obviously it's kind of effectively Danish territory and in essence then kind of part of NATO? I mean, some suggesting that would then be the end of NATO.
Well, it would be a very, very severe crisis for NATO because fundamentally in NATO we respect each other. We respect each other's sovereignties. It is a treaty of nation states. And for one ally within it to attack or take away or annex another nation's sovereign state is everything we don't believe in. And remember, what threatens Putin is NATO's values. Never mind our military capability. It is fundamentally what we stand for as an alliance. And that's an alliance established in 1948 after the war. And what we shouldn't forget is really in sort of 1945, the West, as we know it, rejected the spheres of influence type concept in the military might. We rejected Adolf Hitler. And the Cold War became a sort of fight between the Soviet efforts to have a sort of sphere of influence with communism and ideology. And we based our view on, look, as long as we're all free and independent and democratic with the rule of law, then that is what we all stand for. And that's what America's profited from. It's not just been a negative for the United States. They have enriched themselves globally with trade through that. So have we.
So on Ukraine, there is an argument. I think you and others hold this, that this will kind of embolden or kind of almost legitimises Vladimir Putin's actions in Ukraine. But does it really change the game that much in the sense that, Vladimir Putin's obviously been convinced for quite a long time that kind of Ukraine is his backyard. And what President Trump does in Latin America doesn't really change that foundational ideology, does it?
Well, I think we're in the most powerful nation on earth, effectively aligns itself with that type of view that legality doesn't matter, sovereignty doesn't matter. If you're the biggest, you're the biggest boy in the playground, it doesn't matter.
But haven't the Russians thought that for years? I mean, they would point, and they have done, by the way, over the last decade. So, for example, to US action in Iraq, they would say the US has never really adhered to international law. That was an argument they would consider.
Well, I think what we've seen so far is Russia restrained on the NATO border. They have never really crossed into NATO. We've seen recently in the last 6 months sort of forays of drones into Poland and provocation and sub-threshold activities such as we've seen in the United Kingdom of proxies being used to both target Keir Starmer's properties and indeed firebombing of warehouses in South London in May last year. So we've definitely seen a bit of that. But fundamentally and militarily, the Russians have been cautious of NATO. They haven't wanted to take us on directly. But if the biggest backer of NATO, the man who currently provides 70% of the capability of NATO, decides that he's not for that anymore, or indeed isn't going to be triggered by the breach of the sort of alliance, that's much more dangerous because that leaves Putin open. And Greenland is really important because Greenland is absolutely at the sort of fulcrum between the Western Hemisphere, but also Europe. And what does Putin want more than anything? What does he want going way back to his KGB times? He wants a schism between one side of the Atlantic and the other. He wants the United States and Europe to be in a break that frees him up. And Greenland is the perfect candidate for that. And I wouldn't be surprised if right now bots in St. Petersburg are magnifying across social media as much friction and division as possible around that very thing.
OK, so Ben, as always, thank you very much indeed for that. Let's bring... we're going to take a break, I think, actually. We're going to bring in the panel after the break in reaction to all of that and also looking at potentially further intervention in South America and beyond. What does it mean for the rest of the world? Where could the US strike next? And essentially, is this a game changer when it comes to global affairs? Big questions. We'll try and answer some of them after the break. watching the politics up here on Sky News. Now, after sending in forces to capture the Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro, it seems that Donald Trump may not be done when it comes to foreign intervention. Where could he strike next? Well, the US president gave us some hints on board Air Force One.
Colombia is very sick, too, run by a sick man who likes making cocaine and selling it to the United States. And he's not going to be doing it very long, let me tell you.
What does that mean? He's not going to be doing it very long?
He's not doing it very long. He has cocaine mills and cocaine factories. He's not going to be doing it very long.
So there will be an operation by the U.S. and
it sounds good to me. Cuba always survived because of Venezuela. Now they won't have that money coming in. They won't have the income coming in. You know, a lot of Cubans were killed yesterday. You know that. We need Greenland from a national security situation. It's so strategic. Right now, Greenland is covered with Russian and Chinese ships all over the place. We need Greenland from the standpoint of national security, and Denmark is not going to be able to do it.
Let me just say there are some US bases on Greenland as well. Now, the Prime Minister was asked about all of this, as you saw earlier, about whether it broke international law or not, but he did take a tougher tone when he was speaking to Beth earlier about Greenland and the President's hints of a takeover there.
Can you just reiterate then to our Danish allies that you would condemn Trump going into Greenland, just to be clear?
Well, let me be really clear about Greenland. The future of Greenland is for Greenland and the Kingdom of Denmark. Denmark is a close European ally, a close NATO ally, and the future, therefore, has to be for Greenland, for the Kingdom of Denmark, and only for Greenland and the Kingdom of Denmark, and we're absolutely clear about that.
The Danish Prime Minister's told Trump to stop the threats about Greenland. Do you agree with her?
Well, I'd stand with her.
OK.
And she's right about the future of Greenland.
OK, let's bring back in our panel, Jeremy, Mark and Jasmine tonight. Jeremy, let's start with you on Latin America, Cuba, Colombia, could be others.
I suppose they could, but they're in a very different category, or at least Colombia certainly is. I mean, most people in Latin America, even people in the centre-left, were very frustrated by Maduro, could see the complete dysfunctionality in Venezuela. They're very uneasy about the US intervention. They don't like the way Trump goes about his business, but they're not that unhappy about the end product. In some regards, let's see, because it's a very unstable settlement. But Colombia is in a completely different category. I mean, that is an elected president. He is a thorn in the side of President Trump. He clearly doesn't like him. His term of office expires this year, actually, so he's not eligible to stand again. But I mean, this is the second most populous country in South America, Colombia. It's a big, important country in Latin America with a properly elected president. So the idea that President Trump would be intervening in a country of that type, that is a different category from Venezuela. And even people who can see both sides of the story in Latin America are uneasy, they're disquieted by it, but they can see both sides of the story with Venezuela. I think will not see both sides of the story on Colombia. So,
Mark, let's talk, if we can, about Greenland, because there's the other big issue that we've just been talking about. What do you think, listening to Sir Ben Wallace earlier, about whether what this would do to the NATO alliance, what this would do to the EU, European-US alliance?
Can I just say one word on Cuba,
of course, yes,
because I think Cuba's a more likely target than Colombia, because it's personal for Marco Rubio, apart from anything else. It's also a domestic political issue in America with so many exiled Cubans. So I think maximum pressure on the Cuban regime is likely to be a policy going forward with Donald Trump. I think Ben Wallace was right. It would be a game changer for NATO. I think he said it would be a crisis. I think it would be more than a crisis. It would be very difficult to hold NATO together if America took forcible military action in Greenland against the wishes of both the Danish government and the Greenland government. I don't think Trump will do that. I think it's more likely that he'll use his sort of transactional, threatening approach to secure more concessions for the United States, bigger army bases, maybe a minerals deal, which of course he's always interested in Greenland. I would be surprised, despite what he said today on Air Force One, whether he will take military action directly against a fellow NATO ally.
And Jasmine, I suppose the thing that maybe, from my point of view, has changed kind of really also in the last 48 hours or so is, there's been a lot of criticism of Trump or commentary that lots of it's bluster. He says these things, but in the end, nothing really comes of it. Is Venezuela actually demonstration that it's not all bluster and that at a whim he can, and really sometimes maybe with not a lot of strategic thought, make these decisions?
Do you know what I think people don't want to admit is that actually very little of what Donald Trump has said has turned out to be bluster. I think he was severely underestimated, especially by Europe during his first term. I remember European leaders laughing at him, kind of making fun of him. He was underestimated in the US. He was underestimated in the elections. We never thought that he would be president again. And he continues to be underestimated. So I would remove any idea that anything that he says is bluster. I would look at a couple of things moving forward. He's also very transparent. He's very clear about what he wants. He wants the different domains, the categories that we're talking about: energy, trade, borders. He wants to be able to make huge advancements on all three of those categories so that he could go to the American people and say, I did exactly what I said I was going to do. We're going into midterms in 2026. We're going into another election where he's going to pass the MAGA crown onto someone, and they need to be able to say, we have made you safer and richer as Americans, even if we did it our way in violation of every rule there is. And very quickly, 30 seconds on international law, because I feel like there's a bit of an elephant in the room whenever I'm in conversations about international law, and we don't mention Gaza and the double standards between the wars in Gaza and Ukraine. Because for many of us who follow the Middle East, that's really when we started to see international law crumble and understand that really what international law meant and what the rules-based order meant was rules for the strong. We make the rules. We enforce the rules. The rules are not for everyone. And a lot of people said, well, it's just Gaza, it's just Palestinians, we don't care. Now it's Venezuela, and some people are saying, well, it's just Venezuela, we don't care. But now it's Greenland.
Yeah, and that's clearly a doctrine he does hold to. Interestingly, just on Greenland, I would also say we've heard some of this. You talk about transparency. In his inauguration speech, he talked about wanting to be an expansionist president and territorial expansionist president. And you have to say, if there was somewhere in the world where that seems logical and potentially easier, it could be Greenland. Anyway, we're going to pause on this because we're going to take one last break and we're going to come back to all this and lots more here on the Politics Hub, because it goes beyond even the Western Hemisphere as we've been talking about. What potentially does what happened in Venezuela mean for the rest of the world, for China, for Russia? Is this a new world order? Join us in a couple of minutes.
Coming up on the UK Tonight at 8, we'll get the latest from New York, where the deposed Venezuelan leader, Nicolas Maduro, has pleaded not guilty to drug trafficking. Closer to home, Manchester United have begun the search for another new manager after the sacking of Ruben Amorim. And another blow for the high street as Claire's collapses into administration. All that and much more on the UK Tonight from 8.
The best thing about being a Sky News journalist... Hi, darling.
Beth Rigby, Sky News.
Is being a Sky News journalist. You said to people, I'm not coming back for more, but you have come back for more. Well, let's kick off and make a statement. What can our Prime Minister say to you to not impose tariffs? He's coming out! What more do you need?
I'm Adam Parsons, Sky's Middle East correspondent. I've just entered Gaza. The vista out there is complete destruction. I'll always remember going into Gaza City during the war. All around us was destruction and the sounds of battle. What you see a lot of here are military machines, soldiers, devastation and destruction. What you see very little of are the locals, the Gazans, the people who used to live here, the ghosts of this town. I witnessed the scars of the October the 7th attacks, burnt out homes, bullet holes in walls and bloodstains on the floor.
People were murdered. You have the black flag, you have the yellow flag, people were kidnapped.
Inside this convoy, prisoners released by Israel in exchange for their hostages. Israelis insist that many of these prisoners are terrorists, but here the Palestinians consider them a blend of freedom fighters and political prisoners. There were tears and there was defiance. This land has been farmed for hundreds of years, but now it's a scene of conflict. Israeli settlers have come to this area to seize land.
They've taken the land that I inherited from my father, and my father inherited from his father.
What would happen if you entered?
Oh, we'll be shot.
This is a place where the past is cherished, but the future is feared. These are the settlers in waiting, keen to start a new life, to annex Gaza for Israel.
The least we can do is just kick them out of our land.
Gaza, which is just 2 miles in that direction, is under attack again. Sky News, get the full story first.
Welcome back. Now, the UN Security Council held an emergency meeting today which saw Russia and China both launch attacks on America's actions in Venezuela.
There is no and can be no justification for the crimes cynically perpetrated by the United States in Caracas. We firmly condemn the U.S. act of armed aggression against Venezuela in breach of all international legal norms.
We urge the U.S. to heed the overwhelming voice of the international community, abide by international law and the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, cease infringing upon the sovereignty and security of other countries, stop toppling the government of Venezuela, and return to the path of political solutions.
Right, there we go. Let's bring in our panel again, Jeremy, Mark and Jasmine. So, Mark, let's start with you. What do you think the reaction will have been in the Kremlin and in Beijing to what happened?
Well, I mean, one has to call out the hypocrisy, obviously, of the Russian ambassador at the United Nations, saying they haven't... what America's done is illegal. They haven't abided by the rule of law. After everything they've done in Ukraine, obviously it's rank hypocrisy. The Chinese have a little bit more credibility when they talk about a rules-based order because they have some interest in multilateralism still. I think in the Kremlin they'll be quite happy with what's happened in a way if you're taking it through the Ukraine prism. But on the other hand, Venezuela was an ally, very close ally of Cuba. Cubans were killed in this. A lot of the Russian air defences that Venezuela bought proved to be completely ineffective, of course. So there's some damage, I think, to Russian interests in Latin America. China, as President Trump has rightly said, has been expanding its influence. It's the largest trader, as Jeremy said earlier, to most Latin American countries. And I think they'll be a little bit concerned at talk of America seizing the oil reserves and putting in American oil companies because they're worried about what that means for their supply of oil. Okay. So I think there'll be a sort of mixed picture.
Jasmine?
I agree. And I actually was thinking more about it. I've spent more time thinking about countries who depend on Russia and China versus what Russia and China specifically will do or how this will affect them. I don't think Russia or China, to a lesser extent, like you said, Sir Mark, have ever really paid much attention to international law. This isn't going to give them permission to do anything they wouldn't have done already. But what about countries who have kind of hitched their wagon to Russia or to China? Russia, most of all, if you're the Iranians right now and you're looking and you're thinking, okay, so Russia's probably not going to be coming to our defense.
Well, I mean, you need to
soon.
speak to the Armenians about that.
Right. I mean, to me, it's more, if this is really a world now where might is right and where we have spheres of influence and the U.S. has Western Hemisphere, it also has a little bit of a say what happens everywhere else. If you're smaller countries, you have to hitch your wagon to somebody. And if you don't, then whoever is the bully in your neighbourhood is going to take charge.
OK, Jeremy, just finally on all of this.
Well, I largely agree with Mark and Jasmine. I think it's good for the Russians and Chinese in so much as they can see the West tying itself in knots. There's great division across NATO and elsewhere. But Venezuela was quite an important sort of proxy presence for China and Russia in the Americas. They both supported it being a member of the BRICS, which was vetoed essentially by the Brazilians and a bit of support from the Indians, as I understand it. So Yeah, it was a fly in the ointment. It was an irritant to the United States having Venezuela there. It is about the oil, but it's not just about the oil. It was quite important in geopolitical terms. And I think that was a motive for Donald Trump taking out Maduro. And as a result, both Russia and China have lost a quite important ally of theirs in the Americas.
What do you think, just very, very briefly, do you think if it was Cuba, Moscow would take what would they do? If you can, in 20 seconds.
I'm not sure how much they're in a position to do anything. We will see. But it may well be that the Americans try a slow strangulation rather than something so sort of dramatic and made for TV as they did in Venezuela. But putting yourself in the mind of Donald Trump is a difficult business.
And I think Cuba is a less important ally of Russia than it was of the Soviet Union.
OK, interesting. You know what? It's been a fascinating discussion. We haven't answered all the questions because there are so many of them, but we really appreciate your time, Jeremy Brown, Sir Mark Grant and Jasmine El Gamal. Thank you so much indeed for joining us tonight here on the Politics Hub. And that is it. We'll, of course, have continuing coverage throughout the evening here on Sky News of events in Venezuela and indeed in the United States. Up next, it is the UK Tonight with Sarah Jane Mee. I will see you tomorrow at 7. Bye-bye.